Thanks very much, Vanessa, and good morning to everyone. I think this is turning out to be an EY special because the report, our latest report, which we launched in the autumn time, actually was sponsored by EY. So I want to cover a few things here. I want to tell you a little bit about the background as to why I got interested in the whole subject of women in leadership, which probably by this stage in listening to everyone else and your own situations, you'll know exactly why. And then I want to talk a bit about the report itself with a focus this year on how companies are using targets. So I really have always been interested in the lack of women in management, partly because I was the only woman on my MBA program and the only woman in my graduate traineeship, and so on and so on. So it seemed fairly obvious to me that when it came to doing a PhD, that I should be looking at the lack of women in leadership. So I've always been interested in that. And towards the end of the 90s, I was talking to a number of colleagues across the globe about really how women have progressed and how really, probably in common with many of you, what you see is that actually big organizations tend to be quite effective at actually bringing women in at the kind of graduate entry level. And, you know, in most of our large organizations, we tend to be at parity. But what struck me towards the end of the 90s was that it was really quite shocking that we weren't seeing women taking up serious leadership positions. So we heard earlier from Stephanie talking about in EY, and they've done a fantastic amount of work on trying to advance women, that only 22% of the partners there are women. So I decided that that's really what I wanted to focus on at Cranfield. Really why it is that women are not moving into the leadership positions, why they're not moving through the pipeline. And so I set up a research centre, the International Centre for Women Business Leaders, and we decided really that we wanted to do a bit of a marker each year. So we set up what's called the Female FTSE Report. And that was really looking at the number of women directors in the top FTSE companies. And when we kicked off in 1999, we just looked at the FTSE 100, because in those days, actually, it was quite hard to even get accurate data on those top companies, surprising though it seems probably today. And just to give you a feel as to the progress, I mean, back there in 1999, in our first report, there were just under 7% women directors on the FTSE 100. So you'll see when I come on in a few minutes to where we are today, we have made enormous progress. So as we actually progressed with our reports, what we did, they obviously became more sophisticated, and as well as looking at the advancement of the statistics, the figures on women on boards, we also focused on a particular topic each time. And this past year, what we looked at, actually it was EY's particular interest, which is why we pursued it, was looking at how companies are using targets. Now, let me say a word or two about targets, because some of you may not realise that in both the Davis Review, which took place from 2010 to 2015, an independent inquiry looking at the lack of women on top corporate boards, which I was a member of, and that was then followed by the Hampton-Alexander, which broadened its focus not just on women on the board, but also looked at the two levels below that across the FTSE 350. And that actually is completed this month. So those of you who are interested, the final report comes out on the 24th of February. So one for Harriet to watch. And what's interesting about the UK is the only major country in the world to have pursued the advancement of women on the board using what we call voluntary targets as opposed to quotas. Now, I remember, you know, when we first kicked off 10 years ago, big debates, and discussions amongst women and companies about was that the right way to go. And if you remember at that time, of course, we were members of the EU, and the EU were threatening to bring in a quota of 40% women on top boards across the EU. And just to give you the political background to the Davis report in 2010, the then Prime Minister David Cameron was very opposed to quotas. And indeed, senior chairman in the city then was saying the problem with quotas is they change the numbers, but they don't change the culture. And we in the UK are really keen to get more women into leadership, get more women on the board, but we want to fundamentally change the culture so that it really permeates down the organisation. So that was the reason the UK went for targets. I now realise 10 years on that actually this isn't a binary decision to go for either targets or quotas. Actually, it's a spectrum. And some countries which have had quotas have not kind of delivered it in a very deliberate way, mandatory way, as has somewhere like Norway or France. But actually, the UK, which went for voluntary targets, actually did hard drive them. And there's been a lot of push and pressure and drive from the Investors Association, from changing corporate governance requirements, from the government, and so on. So actually, I would say that we have been quite effective with our targets, but we're not there yet. So just to jump to where we are now in 2020, and you'll recall that I just said way back in 99, 21 years ago, we had just under 7% women on our top 100 boards. We are now at 35%. So, I mean, it's phenomenal progress. And on the FTSE 250 also, we've also met the Hampton-Alexander target of 33% by the end of 2020. So the good news, and just to kind of complement all Harriet's bad news, is we have actually met the targets of 1/3 of all the directors on FTSE 350 boards being women at the end of 2020. But, and there's always buts, there are two huge disappointments for me. And one is that although we have so many women on our top board, so we have like over 300 women sitting on our FTSE 100 boards, when we look at how many women there are in the big jobs, the big influential roles, the roles that really change things, we only have 8 women who chair FTSE 100 boards. So I think this is really quite appalling. We now have had a track record for many years now of women sitting on these boards, but women are not getting through at chair level. So I think that that's one really big problem. The other one is, if we actually look at obviously, then there are non-executive directors who sit on boards, which is where we've made our big progress. Now, it's easy for some cynical people to say, well, that was the quick fix. And it is true, it is the quicker fix. It's easier for senior women to get into NED roles than it is to get into these top executive roles. On the executive side, I would say we've made really glacial progress. I know that's an overused adjective, but it's very apt here. You know, Egon Zehnder, one of the big search consultants, a number of years ago said, we're going to have a campaign to get 25 women CEOs in FTSE 100 boards by 2025. Well, back then there were 5 women CEOs. And at the time of doing our report in September last year, there were still 5 women CEOs in the FTSE 100. So we are making, you know, little to no progress on that executive side. I think we're up to 7 women CEOs now. So there's still a lot of work to do on that. And I think you heard from, you know, earlier from Stephanie about how challenging it really is to get women up those executive pipelines to these top jobs like partner and CEO. So that's a quick overview of the progress that we've made on the FTSE boards. And I want to talk in my remaining time about this special topic we took this year about targets. Now, many of you may have very mixed feelings about targets. But I think that what we found on the gender side is that really, although things like mentoring, women's leadership programs, women's networks are absolutely essential building blocks to supporting women in the workplace, they don't bring fundamental change. And that actually what we have found is that by bringing in targets, by companies taking on targets, that actually you get a real commitment, hopefully, to change taking place. Excuse me. So for this particular study, we talked to a variety of organisations, some professional service firms, some big manufacturing companies from a number of different sectors. The first finding that I want to share with you, which again is a positive one, is that actually there's very little resistance to targets, that all these companies, organisations realise that actually it's the only way forward. It's the only kind of business-like way, unless you put gender targets, ethnicity targets on the same platform as all your other business KPIs, that really they're not properly recognised and followed up. Now, I know that there's still a lot of work to be done in explaining to people about that diversity targets do not compromise meritocracy. And I want to say that again, say something about this, that diversity does not compromise meritocracy. So let's all be honest with ourselves whenever we hear this in the workplace, that actually meritocracy is a complete myth. When we all look at our pipelines in our organisations, as I've said a bit earlier, we can all see at the entry levels, by and large, and I'm sure there are some exceptions, by and large, there is a fair amount of parity between men and women coming in. But as we go up the pipeline, and McKinsey has been very effective at actually monitoring this over the years, that actually you see less and less women coming through and the men coming through. And at the very top, you almost see like 90% men, 10% women. So tell me where the meritocracy is. You know, clearly organisations take a great deal of time to choose very selectively at the start. So is it that we women suddenly become incompetent? I don't think so. I think that what we have to admit is our organisations over-select white men who get to the top. So there is no meritocracy. So when you ever hear this, but you know, the thing that I'm worried about is that I'll get my promotion because I'm a woman. Please remind your colleagues that actually women are discriminated against and have been for the last hundreds of years, and that the idea of targets is not to push women in who don't have the qualifications. Of course not. What targets do is that they recognise that talented women do exist in the pipeline and that they are systematically overlooked, may not be consciously, although I have to say, I don't like this term unconscious bias. I much prefer the term willful blindness. If you actually look at the systems, you have to really challenge as to why so few women are coming through. So looking at targets themselves, I think there's two aspects of targets that are important: how ambitious they are and how you maintain accountability for them. So on how ambitious they are, actually in our experience of talking to organisations this past summer, what we found is that most of them follow the Davis or the Hampton Alexander. So most are going for around about 30% women in leadership positions, leadership roles. Now, some actually are even being more ambitious. And they claim that even if the company doesn't meet those targets, it really is a very good way of mobilising people into action. So I don't know what you've got in your own companies, but it's something to think about. And as we heard again from EY, they have set an exceptionally, I think, ambitious target. It's great to see 40% women in partnership in EY in the UK by 2025. So I think a real organisation to watch on this. Everyone also agreed that we talked to is that targets for gender kind of much more advanced, much more established, it's much more challenging when we think about ethnicity. And one of the problems there in terms of ethnicity is that we use this term BAME, Black, Asian and Minority Ethnics in the UK, which has now been a highly contested term. And I think most of us agree that it is really unusable, because what happens is it pulls together such an enormous group of people and there's such diversity within it. So, I mean, the key one is, and I think Harriet's already made reference to the work on Black Lives Matter. Oh no, I think it was Stephanie earlier in this programme. But, you know, Black people in particular do very, very badly. I know in my own university business school, we have one Black member of the academic faculty, truly appalling. So a lot of work to be done there. So what a number of companies are doing, again, which we found when we spoke to them, is that they actually have a separate target for Black people, and then ones for the rest of the Asian and minority ethnics. The third point that I want to make is on this accountability. It seems to be very difficult to hold people accountable for the targets. I think some of the more advanced organisations are really trying to tie targets to leadership performance, as you do in any other way for any other targets you might have in your work. But there is great ambivalence about how to do this. And also, I think another key point about accountability is that when you set an overall target for your organisation, how do you actually cascade that down? Talking to a number of D&I directors, I mean, what they say is that you've really got to look at the individual business units and sectors individually. I mean, we had a good example earlier of Stephanie, who said that she works in oil and gas. Now that's very, very much dominated by men. So to say to her sector in EY, when she's the only female partner, well, we want 40% in a few years' time in your particular sector, could be very inappropriate in EY. So what organisations are doing is to look in detail at the different sections, the different business units, and to set different targets in different parts so that overall you meet the target that was set for the organisation. And this requires, I think, great awareness and insight into all your statistics, your HR statistics, and an ability to really analyse them, that you come up with realistic ones. So lastly, the last point I want to make is that targets really are seen as a tool for culture change, because when targets are implemented thoroughly and ambitiously, targets do really create scrutiny and unroot bias across key talent management processes. So if you take, for example, if you're doing a kind of promotion selection cycle, and you have got quite a number of women in that talent pool, say 40%, but only 20% come through to be promoted, that really should make you challenge what's gone wrong here. We have got all these women in this talent pool. Why have they not come through? One of the points that I really like of Sir Philip Hampton's on the Hampton-Alexander review is he's saying, when we select for a new chair for a FTSE company, we shouldn't just have one woman on the short list. You probably all are familiar with research from Harvard saying that if you're one woman on a short list, you're unlikely to get the job because you look different and the characteristics of that one different person tend to get diminished. You need to have at least two. So what Sir Philip Hampton is saying is that on every shortlist for a chair, you should have 5 people, of whom 2 are women. So my last point on targets is that targets, when they're used very effectively and robustly, really do root out where the bias is, and really helps to foster a more data-driven approach to making decisions about people, and I think create the bedrock for a much more systematic focus on inclusion. So I've done a lot of talking there. I hope there's a chance for if anyone wants to ask me questions either now or outside of the session, please go ahead. So back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Sue. Really interesting stuff. I've popped a copy of the report link into the chat group, and a number of the other things that Sue referenced there, such as the Parker Review, Hampton Alexander, which we've had people come and talk to us about before, but you know, always happy to have them back to see the progress they're making. So do keep in touch with Sue. Sue, you also do, just quickly before we move on, your Women to Watch list, don't you?
So we do indeed.
Always women for that.
Yes, so again, a little bit of background on that. Around 10 years ago, I was challenged by several senior people in the city saying, well, Sue, don't you think it's going to be a problem trying to get so many women on your board? I mean, are there really that many talented women around? And I was truly shocked by the person who had made this comment to me. So as Vanessa says, what we run in parallel to our report is 100 Women to Watch. Now, these are potential women you can't have sat on a FTSE board, but you may have sat on a charity or a school or whatever. But if you are one or you know of one, please send me an email. Every year we like to really kind of draw from as wide a pool as possible, particularly looking for women from unusual sectors and particularly women from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. But, you know, if any of you know of anyone or you are one yourself, please send me an email.